Um,
So on the opposite side of the very like empirical study of consciousness, what do you think on the flip end of like the panpsychists and I guess like more radical philosophical theories?
yeah, I mean, again, I don't have any knockdown arguments. So there are lots of smart people who have much more sophisticated things to say than I can hear. I'm not sympathetic to panpsychism, as fascinating as an idea it is. Um, it doesn't like the very simple claim that microphysical uh, parts or particles or whatever can have consciousness just seems to be too watered down. It seems to water down the notion of consciousness to the point of meaninglessness. Um, and so, yeah, I'm inclined to think that consciousness is more pervasive in the natural world than we once realized, but that it has a kind of biological origin. As mysterious as that origin may be thus far, um, consciousness emerges or comes into existence with a certain kind of biological organization and with the functioning of certain electrochemical systems, let's say, in the right way. And absent that kind of functional organization and physical makeup, then I'm inclined to think that, yeah, not everything is conscious. To claim as such would be um, to make consciousness into a meaningless idea. Um, of course, people dispute that for various reasons. But yeah, panpsychism has all sorts of problems that are well known on its own. Um, if microphysical entities have consciousness, well then how is it that they can sum up together to get a single conscious perspective, as I seem to have? How is it that individually conscious neurons, to the extent they can be individually conscious, aggregate together, combine together? This is called the combination problem, as is well known. That's a problem for panpsychism, of course. I guess it can be yeah, it's by no means a knockdown problem. Like, there are lots of responses to that. You could be a cosmopsychist and say, well, it's not, we don't have to worry about this problem, this combination problem. We just say that there's one consciousness, there's one universal consciousness, conscious mind. And then we have to figure out, well, how is it that we get the appearance, at least, of individual, discrete, and diverse and distinct conscious minds out of this one conscious whole? That's a problem that's been discussed in certain traditions of Indian philosophy. But yeah, so there's a whole rainbow of views and disputes throughout the history of philosophy that are now becoming put into more sharp contrast and resolution. But long story short, I don't find panpsychism particularly promising as a worldview or as a theory of consciousness, and it is hard to test, right? I don't know how it would recommend scientists to go about confirming it, and they'll probably say, well, you can't, right? It's not something that can be confirmed by science. But then I'm inclined to give it less weight, theoretically.
Yeah. So just moving away from, I guess, the philosophy of mind for a bit. I know a lot of your research focuses on like the Chinese, Indian, or like Buddhist philosophical traditions. I don't have much experience in them, if I'm honest. So I wanted to ask if you could maybe, I know it's a big question, but explain how these philosophical traditions sort of differ from the analytic philosophy.
Yeah, so my specialization is mostly in classical Indian and classical Indian Buddhist or South Asian philosophy, philosophers that were writing texts in Sanskrit, especially. I have some familiarity with Chinese philosophy, but philosophy of mind, so we don't have to move away from philosophy of mind, because, as it turns out, philosophy of mind was very much prevalent in classical philosophical traditions, especially in South Asia. Less so in China. It was less developed as an explicit theme. But yeah, there's hugely rich history of philosophical debate and argumentation in classical India on questions of philosophy of mind, and questions that are very much recognizable, should be recognizable to your ordinary, your modern day analytic philosopher of mind. So So yeah, so one thing to say would be to say that there's actually a continuity, a very obvious continuity in the kinds of questions and pursuits that classical Indian philosophers undertook as regards philosophy of mind, as well as philosophy more broadly, especially metaphysics more broadly, epistemology more broadly. And as to what makes something an analytic philosophy, I mean, the word, the not concept of analytic philosophy can mean different things to different people. If you're talking about this method of conceptual analysis, of figuring out what it is that we mean, like philosophy is the basically study of what our concepts mean. I mean that that also goes on to a degree in Indian philosophy. But if you just mean analytic philosophy as like sort of philosophy that puts primacy on logical argumentation, on standards of evidence and sources of knowledge, and rigorous argumentation and debate, then that is very much there in classical India. Of course, you have the earlier stages of the philosophical tradition, where you have texts which are not so directly oriented around debate, even though philosophical debate goes back to the very beginnings of Indian intellectual history. You have texts like the Upanishads, which are sort of these mystical or revealed texts, you might say, where they're putting forth a kind of philosophical worldview and claims about the nature of reality and consciousness, and actually the identity between consciousness and absolute reality, but not in the form of like fine, rigorous and precise arguments. Those arguments, the logical argumentation, becomes systematized a bit later in classical India. But once it does, then you have philosophy that is very clearly recognizable to a modern philosopher of mind as being analytic in the sense of being precise and rigorous in argumentation, in that basic sense, and also dealing with basic questions that we are still dealing with. So the mind-body problem, right? Most classical Indian philosophers were dualists. They thought that there's the physical body and physical stuff, and then there are mental mental entities. Those could be substances of various sorts. They have different theories of the soul as distinct from the physical body. The physical body dies, but the soul is eternal for various philosophical traditions. Buddhist philosophical traditions deny the existence of an eternal soul. They still think that there are mental property or mental states, mental events that don't belong to a soul. So now you have a classical, basic philosophical debate about the nature and existence of the self. So that's one metaphysical debate that's very much a part of philosophy of mind. You have all sorts of debates regarding epistemology as well as philosophy of mind, as concerns perception, the nature of our perceptual experience and contact with the world. Do we perceive the world directly, or is our perception mediated by a sort of by the intervention of mental images, such that we're not perceiving the world directly, we're perceiving first these mental images, and then we have to infer the existence of the external world from the images that are directly present to our mind. So yeah, that's another topic of much debate. So yeah, so basically, I mean, if you can think about most every kind of philosophical position in the philosophy of mind that you can think of, there was a position that's adjacent to it in classical Indian philosophy. And yeah, I can get into more details if you have specific questions. At the same time, I should also say that it's not as though classical Indian philosophy was just sort of analytic philosophy before there was analytic philosophy, like as though they're sort of, they're like the hipsters of analytic philosophy. Like they were doing analytic philosophy before it was cool in the West many thousands of years later. Rather, there are certain basic, intellectual problems that human minds come up against, they come to grapple with just in virtue of being a human mind. And these problems were taken up in great depth by Indian philosophers and philosophers of mind. At the same time, though, they also have something new to tell us for people who have been educated just in modern Western philosophy and philosophy of mind in particular. For one, there are certain positions that they occupy that are novel if as compared to certain modern philosophical positions. There are certain debates where Indian philosophers don't have the same sorts of preconceptions about the nature of the mind or the nature of perception that, say, modern philosophers might have, or might have taken for granted following from the history of modern philosophy. And I can be more specific about all this. And also they have a kind of distinct orientation as well. So you might think that most modern philosophers of mind want to understand the mind for its own sake, because they seek truth or better understanding of the world. Indian philosophers did as well, but they also sought to vindicate or pursue philosophy for its own, not just for its own sake, not just to be right about a given dispute or debate to win an argument, but also because in winning an argument or winning a debate, that was supposed to be reflective of your having a better conception of reality, and a better conception of reality that would also conduce to your happiness, to the ultimate elimination or alleviation of your suffering through soteriological means. In other words, that there is this existential problem of human existence, that human existence is inherently unfulfilling and subject to suffering. And especially if you had this cosmological view that we are perpetuating the cycle of existence over many lifetimes, and none of these lifetimes provide any sort of lasting rest and fulfillment and relief from the suffering and frustration and disappointment that comes about with just living and having a body, and confronting the fact of death and so on. So a proper understanding of reality would allow us to stop this cycle in some way or another. And so, yeah, having a correct understanding of reality, a philosophical account, a systematic account of reality, how we come to know about reality, the means of knowledge, so straightforwardly epistemological notions, and the epistemological study of perception and logical inference and testimony, whether scriptural or ordinary. These are all supposed to contribute to a broader project of liberation or a freedom from suffering. And that kind of orientation is something that's not always present in modern analytic philosophy. But it's interesting to see how that might shape the philosophical endeavor if we actually take it seriously.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if I'm getting this right, in the Indian Buddhist philosophical tradition, philosophy has some like soteriological value in terms of alleviating suffering. Is there like a specific reason behind that, or is that mostly just because of the Buddhist philosophy behind it?
Well, yeah, so there's a specific reason, and it's a shared assumption among Buddhist and non-Buddhist philosophers. So there are lots of non-Buddhist, you can call them Vedic philosophers, or there are Jaina philosophers who are neither Buddhist nor Vedically or aligned. And then there are actually materialist philosophers who denied all any sort of religious or supernatural account of the universe. In any case, so leaving aside the materialists who denied any kind of like otherworldly salvation or release from suffering, the idea that philosophy could liberate from suffering comes from this idea that what perpetuates our suffering or our sort of mistaken way or sort of self-defeating way of living or going about our existence is ignorance. That it's because we are ignorant in some sense of some basic facts about reality that we then act in ways that are actually not conducive to any kind of lasting alleviation of suffering or happiness or whatever. And that makes sense in a simple case where you think about, like, if I'm wrong about what's in my water bottle, I don't realize actually there is I don't know, there's poison or like some sort of chemical in my water, and if I keep drinking it and I remain ignorant of that fact, some sort of odorless chemical in my water that's actually going to poison me, then I'm going to be made very sick due to my ignorance about what's actually there in the world. So too, if you don't realize that what are the real sources of your suffering, then you're going to keep making these mistakes about how reality actually is, and in that way you'll perpetuate your own misery. So the basic fact that we're ignorant of is, depends on whether you're Buddhist or not Buddhist. But both Buddhists and non-Buddhists agree in a basic sense that we make these basic mistakes about the nature of who we are and the nature of what actually is the lasting source of happiness. We think we make the mistake that the things that actually cause suffering are in fact the sources of our happiness. So oftentimes these are identified as like sensory pleasures or sensual, the objects that give us, that fulfill our sensual sensory desires, right? We seek after these things, we chase things that allow us to accrue more and more sort of sensory pleasure, and we never actually get satisfied by them for basic reasons, right? Because of our very makeup and orientation, we keep seeking and craving after these things, but they can't actually give us any lasting fulfillment. And also with that comes a basic ignorance about the fact of who we are, right? We think that we are this individual ego. This is for most Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools will think this way, that we are mistaken. We are ignorant of the fact that who we really are is not what we normally identify ourselves as being. So your sort of individual bounded ego that you identify with your body or with your sort of material possessions, that's not who you really are. You are either something else, some other type of consciousness or soul that exists beyond your body and beyond your limited ego, or there is no actual self at all. And the idea then is to deconstruct the ego and deconstruct the sense of self thereby, and see reality as it is, as just a fleeting set of psychophysical events that belong to no one, and that when we stop identifying with them or stop clinging on to them as being me or as being mine, then we'll stop perpetuating the sort of self-defeating patterns of behavior that these mistakes perpetuate, in other words. So in that sense, the alleviation of ignorance is serves the goal of the alleviation of our suffering, and that's where philosophy comes in.
That's really interesting. I want to segue from there to your paper, Is the Mind a Magic Trick? So I'm by no means an expert on illusionism or anything. So could you just please explain maybe what the illusionistic stance is?
Right. So some context. So this paper is the mind a magic trick? Subtitle: Illusionism about consciousness in the quote-unquote consciousness-only theory of Vasubandhu and Sthiramati. So Vasubandhu and Sthiramati were these two classical Buddhist philosophers in South Asia, and they were affiliated with the Yogacara tradition of Mahayana Buddhism. So for some backstory, I guess, you have the about 1,000 odd years of development of Buddhism, both as a religious and political institution, as well as a set of philosophical doctrines and various branching and splitting traditions of philosophical Buddhism. And in the Mahayana tradition, you have one major branch called Yogacara. And these philosophers are famous. They were known in classical India, especially by their opponents, as being idealists. Basically, they denied that we ever experience any external mind-independent reality, that the objects that seem to be there in front of us that are not us, that are not my mind, that exist, that have some kind of mind-independent or extramental existence, don't actually have an extramental existence. You're only ever acquainted with what appears to the mind. So this is the sense in which everything that exists is mind only or consciousness only. It doesn't have any extramental existence out there, outside the mind. And Yogacara philosophers typically defend this position that you don't have any epistemic access to what exists outside of the mind. And in fact, the idea of a physical object made up of microphysical parts that are themselves atomic or partless is itself incoherent. They give Vasubandhu in one text gives an argument for why the very idea of a physical atom is incoherent. So you have epistemological and metaphysical arguments for why a mind-independent world of objects is impossible or unknowable. But that's not the whole story, as it turns out, because along with this picture that there is no external world to be grasped or apprehended by the mind, they also deny that there is any sort of internal subject, any internal self, or any type of mental state that actually would grasp such an object. So they deny that there is any sort of real object that can cause our experiences, and thereby, in having that experience, we are aware of the object that caused it. And they also deny that there are, if there's no object to experience, then there also should be no experience. If experiences are constitutively understood as mental states that grasp objects or present objects or make it appear as though they take on the appearance of some object, right? So it's like I have this this mental state. I seem to be having a perception of a laptop in front of me. Turns out we have no reason to believe there is a laptop in front of me. And that means also then that the appearance or the mental state in which there is an appearance of a laptop is also somehow fictional, right? Or it's not genuinely as though there is a mental state which grasps or appears as a laptop. So in other words, they want to, it's not that there's just straightforward idealists who think that consciousness alone exists, or that mental images alone exist, or mental ideas alone exist. Because according at least to Vasubandhu and Siddharmati, I try to, I think it's generally acknowledged by most modern recent Yogacara scholarship, is that they are non-dualists. They advocate for a non-dual picture of reality where there are no external objects, certainly, but then there also are no internal subjects or mental states that represent an external world, right? If there's no external world to represent, then there's no sense in which any mental state is genuinely a representation of anything, right? All representational states then are empty or are merely apparent. They merely appear to represent something, but are not actually representing anything. Right? So it's like as though if you get rid of the thing to be represented or grasped, then, or the thing which would be thing of which the mental state would be an appearance of, like you have some mental image, and that mental image is the image of a laptop. If there's no laptop there, then there's in some sense in which it also doesn't make sense for there to be an appearance of anything, right? There's no of there. So there's just mental state. But this mental state also has a kind of fictional status. What they really defend is, so coming to the point of illusionism, is that, so there's this non-dual, reality is non-dual. It's something beyond, it's not extramental, it's not physical, let's say, as opposed to mental. And it's also not mental as opposed to physical. It's something that transcends all of our abilities to conceptualize it and speak about it in language. And we can have a kind of direct non-conceptual realization of this reality or vision of this reality, but it's not a kind of mental reality in the sense that we are ordinarily acquainted with as unenlightened, unawakened beings. So what's fascinating about this Yogacara tradition, which is commonly understood as idealism again, is that they too also think that the mind-only view, or consciousness-only view, that everything that appears to the mind is itself just mental, is nothing but a mental representation. That view is also to be transcended in some sense. And you're supposed to realize that reality is non-dual, perhaps beyond the mind. That last step, whether reality is really beyond the mind, is a subject of dispute. I can come back to that. So in this paper, what I try to do is make sense of some people who've argued that Vasubandhu, who again, in many of his texts, defends this mind, his most prominent texts, the 20 verses and 30 verses on the proof of the thesis that everything is mind only, or everything is nothing but a mental representation, that he too also denies that there's anything like real subjectivity or something real, like real phenomenal consciousness. J. Garfield is one contemporary philosopher of mind and also a scholar of Buddhist philosophy who put forward this reading. And when I started reading Garfield's paper and coming to understand illusionist theories of consciousness, it seemed totally bizarre. Like one as a reading of Vasubandhu, who I thought of as a straightforward idealist, and also as just a general thesis about philosophy of mind, about the existence of consciousness or phenomenal consciousness, right? To deny phenomenal consciousness seems like the most absurd thing you can possibly do. So Galen Strawson has called this sort of view the great silliness. Like it's the most, like akin to doubting that, whereas Descartes thought you can never doubt the existence of thinking, because in the very act of doubting is to think, is to instantiate thinking. So too, even if phenomenal consciousness is it's a hallucination, right? We never actually, like, there is no actual laptop out there. That's just an illusion. There only appears to be a laptop, but it can't be false, or it can't be an illusion that there is still the appearance of a laptop, right? That can't be doubted. I could be wrong that there is a laptop out there in the world. I could be wrong that there is an external world in the first place, but I can't be wrong that there is the appearance of a laptop, right? The phenomenal consciousness, just the very fact, the very notion of phenomenon in Greek, right, as what appears, that is what phenomenal consciousness amounts to, is the appearance of something. And you can't have a kind of appearance-reality distinction when it comes to mental appearances themselves. So that seemed to me to be obvious. And then the question is, of course, how do we account for that mental appearance? It's reality. Is it something over and above the physical? So then we have a dualist picture. Is it real but still reducible to what the physical world is made of? Then we have a kind of reductionist picture. And the illusionist wants to say that this is all hopeless, right? It's that there is this unbridgeable, there would be this unbridgeable explanatory gap if we acknowledge that phenomenal consciousness exists. But we can get rid of the gap. There is no gap because phenomenal consciousness does not exist, right? The dualist wants to say that there is really a gap because there is really this other type of reality, namely mental properties or mental stuff. The reductionist wants to get rid of the gap, has trouble doing so thus far, because they want to say that phenomenal consciousness is real, that there are these qualitative states, these states of qualia, or properties, qualitative properties that belong to mental states that make them have something it is like to undergo them, but we can somehow reduce them to the physical, physical brain states, let's say. The illusionist wants to say that this is all hopelessly misguided, and they have a helpful metaphor. And this, coming back to why my paper's titled this way, is the mind a magic trick. That this metaphor is also invoked in Buddhist discussions, very much so in Mahayana discussions and Yogacara discussions, but also there are passages in the original Buddha's discourses, where he compares consciousness, what we would translate commonly as consciousness, or vijnana, or vijnana, as he compares it to a magic trick. So I'll just explain the metaphor to illustrate what illusionists are getting at, because it's a very seductive metaphor, or analogy rather. So take any old magic trick. Say you have a magician has an empty hat and pulls a rabbit out of the hat, right? And that's the magic trick. Shows you a totally empty hat, and yet a rabbit magically appears. So there are three possible responses you can have to what you just saw as in the audience, right? You could have a kind of radicalist response. You say, well, this is crazy. This changes everything. That our current scientific worldview cannot account for how the rabbit really came out of the hat. So this picture says that there's a response takes it that the rabbit really did come out of the hat, and our current science cannot explain how a real rabbit would come out of a totally empty hat. And that's akin to a kind of dualist response in the explanatory gap case. Then you have a kind of conservative response, who says, no, the rabbit really did come out of the hat, but we can explain how this happened. We can explain how a rabbit would come out of an empty hat without radically revising our current science, without like seeking brand new types of non-physical laws or whatever. Current science can explain how the rabbit really came out of the empty hat. And the most plausible response is the illusionist response, is to say, well, the rabbit didn't really come out of an empty hat. Actually, the rabbit only seemed to come out of the empty hat. And then we explained how the illusion of a rabbit coming out of an empty hat would come about, right? And turns out that the hat's not actually empty, it has a false door or whatever. And the magician did a bunch of visual tricks to make you not realize that. And then it appears as though a rabbit came out of an empty hat. So that's the illusionist response to the magic trick. The illusionist response to the magic trick of consciousness is that it only seems as though you have these purely subjective, first personal, ineffable, intrinsic, infallibly knowable qualitative states, right? These are all those properties that are typically associated with conscious qualitative states, i.e. qualia, or conscious qualitative properties. It only seems as though you have such states. And now we have to figure out how the brain, so illusionists are typically physicalists, how it is that the brain goes about generating the illusory appearance that it has a conscious, non-physical, like a sort of non-physical, purely subjective, infallibly knowable, intrinsic, ineffable experience of a laptop or of a red rose, right? Why is it that brains would play this trick on themselves, as though making themselves think as though they are having these qualitative states, and then to say nothing of the illusion that the brain generates for itself of being a conscious subject or a soul, or then we can talk about illusionist accounts of why we think that there's such a thing like God. But leaving aside that, we're talking about illusionist accounts of how the brain generates this sense that it is having conscious first personal subjective experiences that are not physical, that seem to be purely subjective, ineffable, and intrinsic, and so on. So that's the contemporary illusionist picture. As it turns out, Vasubandhu Siddhamati and other early Yogacara philosophers, there's a later history of Yogacara where they are not illusionists. They straightforwardly believe that reality is non-dual, but reality is non-dual consciousness. We'll set them aside for now. Vasubandhu and Siddhamati in this earlier phase of Yogacara are not so explicit. And when they come to analyze the mind, right, the mind that they talk about when they say everything is mind only is what they call, the Sanskrit is abhuta parikalpa. Abhuta is non-existent. To be is the verb is related to this verb bhu in Sanskrit, and abhuta is what does not exist. And parikalpa means something like imagination or fabrication, like the fictional production, the construction of what is non-existent. And so these philosophers, Vasubandhu and Siddhamati, they claim that everything that appears to the mind is a fabrication. So the laptop out there, the internal self that I take myself to have in here, whatever, these are all fabrications. These are all conceptual fictions, like straightforward conceptual fictions, such as the fiction of Harry Potter. Harry Potter does not actually exist. It just exists in my mind, right? It has a purely nominal or mental existence. So what mind fundamentally is the fabrication of what is non-existent. And so then I go through in the paper trying to argue against my initial reading several years ago that actually Vasubandhu and Siddhamati, they come quite close to adopting a kind of illusionist picture of the mind, whereby the mind is this fundamentally causal process for generating the fiction of mental appearances, right? The fiction that there are these mental states that represent some object out there in virtue of having an appearance of the object in here, as it were. These appearances are illusory. And unlike phenomenal realists who would claim that, no, the appearances, insofar as they exist, even if they're illusory about the external world, they still are real to the extent they are really appearances. Vasubandhu and Siddhamati have like contemporary illusionists, have ways of getting around that objection by saying that these appearances are actually just constructed by conceptual processes, by processes of introspection and really introspective misrepresentation, right? It's as though one mental state takes on the appearance of presenting a laptop because it's being interpreted as such by another mental state, or it's being fabricated, or sort of yeah, one mental state is sort of, again, yeah, fictionalizing another mental state as being the appearance of, or as containing the appearance of a laptop, or any appearance, like even the appearance of pain, or the appearance of anything that appears to mind. Mental appearances as such are conceptual constructions. And this, again, to wrap up, this picture is very much very much resonates with contemporary illusionists like Daniel Dennett or Keith Frankish or Francois Camerer, who give us these kinds of cognitive accounts of how the illusion of phenomenality comes about. Yeah, so this was fascinating to me, and it took me many years to make sense of all this. And so I just have a paper that's forthcoming in a journal, making the case that Vasubandhu and Sthirumati are very much seem to be illusionists about phenomenal consciousness. So yeah, that's the paper in a nutshell.
Yeah, you actually stole my question, because I was going to ask, why did you name your paper "Is the Mind a Magic Trick?" And that's really cool. I think the analogy does make a lot of sense, and I think
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting. Do you mind if I put the link to your paper in the YouTube?
sure. Yeah, so there's a preprint. At some point there will be the officially published version. It'll be published in an open access journal called Ergo, open access philosophy journal. That should happen the next couple of months, I've been told. But yeah, there's preprint available online. So sure, by all means.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for your time today. It was really, really interesting to hear about your paper, as well as all your thoughts on philosophy of mind. I really enjoyed discussing this with you, and I just want to say thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right, thank you.